his pillow drenched with froth and filth. The king's body, once wrapped in silk, now twisted in fever, trembled violently as he clutched at his chest, as if trying to rip the lungs out with his bare hands. He was 23 years old. For a man born to rule, Charles died like an animal cornered and poisoned. This was not the solemn deathbed tableau immortalized in oil paintings and court poetry. There was no final confession whispered to a priest, no calm acceptance of God's will. Instead, there was only raw fear, agonizing pain, and a maddening torrent of hallucinations. According to court chroniclers, Charles repeatedly begged for water, but when handed a chalice, he recoiled, screaming that it was filled with blood. What made his agony unbearable to witness wasn't just its physical violence, but the sense that the pain was more than physiological, that it was earned, that it had meaning, as if his body was exacting punishment for something unspeakable. And there was something. 7 months earlier, under Charles's trembling signature, tens of thousands of Protestants had been hunted down in one of the most brutal mass killings in European history, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. What began as a political maneuver to neutralize religious enemies quickly turned into a citywide orgy of murder, rape, and mutilation, an act of state violence so shocking that even hardened diplomats from Spain were horrified. Charles IX gave the order, or perhaps more accurately, he allowed it, and in doing so he signed not just the death warrant for thousands of his subjects, but his own soul. As the blood spilled in the streets of Paris, something inside the young king fractured. Over the following months, his behavior turned erratic, his health deteriorated rapidly, and his nights were haunted by the sound of imagined screams. Witnesses described him as a man who looked into hell and found himself there. When his body finally began to decay from within, coughing up blood and bile, the physicians diagnosed him with tuberculosis. But those closest to the king knew better. This wasn't just a disease, it was penance. To understand how a king came to die screaming, we must first understand the boy who was never meant to wear the crown. Charles Maxime, second son of Henry II of France and Catherine de' Medici, was born in 1550 into a world already buckling under the weight of blood and politics. His birth was not greeted with the grandeur reserved for heirs. That distinction belonged to his older brother Francis, a sickly but crown-bound child on whom the hopes of the Valois dynasty were heaped like bricks on a crumbling wall. Charles was the spare, a political footnote, and yet it would be Charles who would inherit the throne, and with it, the curse. Charles IX's early years were marked by fragility, both physical and emotional. He was a pale, nervous child, prone to nosebleeds, fevers, and sudden fits of rage followed by hours of despondent silence. In court paintings, he's often depicted with dark, haunted eyes. Even as a child, those eyes would one day watch his people die by the thousands, and later would weep for it in private when no courtiers were watching. His mother, Catherine de' Medici, was no soft presence. An Italian-born queen consort with a political mind sharper than any blade at court. She viewed her children as pawns in a chess game played against enemies both foreign and domestic, and Charles, frail, pliable, emotionally volatile, was her most malleable piece. By the time Charles was 10, the throne had already devoured one king. Francis II, barely 15, died of a brain abscess in 1560, leaving the crown unexpectedly vacant. Charles was next in line, not because he was ready, but because there was no one else. He was just 10 years old, and France was a firestorm. The France Charles IX inherited wasn't a kingdom. It was a powder keg, moments from detonation. The country was being ripped apart by religious strife between Catholics and Protestants, Huguenots. Streets ran red with sectarian violence. Churches were burned, families slaughtered. Peace was a lie told by both sides. Catherine de' Medici, ever the survivor, realized that her son was far too young, too fragile to control this chaos. So she tightened her grip, ruling in his name, manipulating the court with a quiet ruthlessness that would make Machiavelli proud. Charles, still barely an adolescent, was pulled in all directions by scheming uncles, foreign ambassadors, Protestant reformers, and bloodthirsty Catholic nobles. He learned early that the crown was not a symbol of glory, it was a noose, and he was already feeling it tighten. He was taught to lie, to flatter, to agree with everyone and trust no one. He learned diplomacy from his mother, but not conviction. The lessons were survival, not sovereignty. And in this crucible of paranoia, betrayal and violence, the boy king began to fracture. As he grew into adolescence, Charles IX showed signs of acute psychological distress. He was prone to mood swings, long periods of brooding silence interrupted by sudden bursts of rage. He lashed out at servants, courtiers, even his beloved hunting dogs. One ambassador wrote that the young king laughs in the morning, weeps at noon, and curses God by dusk. His writings reveal a tortured self-image. In private notes he would scribble about death, divine punishment and damnation. He often wrote the phrase, "I was not born to rule, but to be ruled." The only true escape he found was in hunting, not for sport but for blood. He became obsessed with the chase, driving animals to the brink of exhaustion, wounding them, then finishing them off with his own hands. It was the only time he felt in control. But what began as therapy would soon become pathology. Charles IX was not a sadist in the traditional sense. He did not revel in cruelty for pleasure. He feared the violence within himself, and yet, when pushed, when cornered, he would lash out with a savagery that seemed to surprise even him. Those around him noticed it. His mother feared it. His enemies hoped to provoke it. This was the young man who would be asked just a few years later to decide the fate of tens of thousands of his subjects. He would be told that it was necessary, that it would be swift, that it would bring peace. Instead, it brought madness and eventually screaming death. By the age of 15, Charles IX wore the French crown, but it hung from his neck like a stone. Though officially declared of age in 1563, the court knew what his coronation really meant. Catherine de' Medici would continue to rule. She had not spent her life navigating the blood-drenched labyrinth of French politics, just to step aside now. Charles was king in title only. The real power sat behind him, veiled in widow's black, whispering commands into his ear, while smiling sweetly at the nobility. The Queen Mother, brilliant, ruthless, and terrified of losing her dynasty, would stop at nothing to keep her sons on the throne, even if that throne had to be built on corpses, and the corpses were coming. France during Charles's reign was a theological war zone. The battle between Catholics and Protestants wasn't just about doctrine, it was about survival, power, and vengeance. Each side saw the other not merely as mistaken, but as a threat to the very fabric of the kingdom. Heresy was treason, compromise was betrayal. The court itself reflected this divide. Inside the Louvre, enemies dined within arm's reach of each other. Protestant nobles like Admiral Gaspard de Coligny argued for peace and reform, while Catholic hardliners like the Duke of Guise demanded purges and executions. Charles was trapped between them, a boy trying to referee a fire with paper gloves. He vacillated constantly, one day leaning Protestant, granting toleration, the next falling under pressure from Catholic factions and backpedaling. His decisions pleased no one, and his inconstancy only fueled paranoia. Outside the court walls, the country was tearing itself apart. Towns were razed. Entire families were massacred for the crime of attending the wrong church. Heads were displayed on pikes, and bodies were left to rot in city squares as warnings. The air of France reeked not just of death, but of revenge held on a loop. Charles IX could not control it. More horrifying still, he was beginning to accept it. In an attempt to force unity, Catherine devised a political marriage between Charles's Catholic sister, Margaret of Valois, and Henry of Navarre, a Protestant prince and future king. The idea was simple. merge the families, symbolically unite the faiths, and end the cycle of blood. But politics, like poisons, are often slow-acting. The marriage would bring thousands of Protestants into Catholic Paris for the wedding celebration, a decision many warned would be explosive. Still, the wedding proceeded in August 1572 amid immense fanfare. To outsiders, it seemed a moment of optimism. But inside the Louvre, knives were being sharpened. Just days after the wedding, an assassin shot Admiral Coligny in the street. He survived. Barely. The Protestant court members, enraged, accused the Catholic guy's faction of orchestrating the attempt. Tensions skyrocketed. Angry Protestant nobles demanded justice. Catholic leaders whispered of an uprising. The smell of violence lingered in the halls like rot in the rafters, and Charles IX, already weakened by anxiety, sleeplessness, and constant pressure, was pushed toward the edge. What happened next would mark him forever. On the night of August 23rd, 1572, Catherine convened a secret council in Charles's chambers. There was only one item on the agenda: what to do with Coligny and the Protestant leaders. Catherine, fearing Protestant retaliation for the assassination attempt, argued for a preemptive strike, kill the leaders, remove the threat, end the Protestant influence in court. Charles hesitated. He reportedly shouted, wept, and even tore at his hair. He knew the implications. Killing noble guests would violate sacred laws of hospitality and brand his reign with eternal disgrace. But the voices around him were relentless. They spoke of survival, of duty, of France. And finally, something inside Charles snapped. He is said to have cried out, "Well then, kill them all so that no one is left to reproach me." This was not strategy. It was surrender, and it was the beginning of his damnation. It began with a single shot. In the dim hours before dawn on August 24th, 1572, soldiers entered the home of Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, dragged him from his bed, and threw him from a window. He landed broken but alive until a noble stepped forward and stabbed him through the heart. Then they cut off his head, then they hacked off his hands, then they stripped his corpse and paraded it through the streets. Then they hung it by its feet in front of the crowds. This was not war. This was message, and it was only the beginning. That morning, under cover of royal orders, thousands of Protestant leaders, nobles, merchants, and wedding guests were slaughtered in their beds. Their homes were invaded, their families dragged into the streets. Some were butchered in front of their wives. Others were thrown from windows or burned alive in their cellars. The bells of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois rang out not for mass, but for massacre. The Seine ran red with blood. Paris became a slaughterhouse and the king its silent butcher. The killing lasted for days. Protestant men, women and children were hunted house by house. Pregnant women were cut open and their unborn babies dashed against walls. Corpses floated in rivers, clogged alleyways, and lay stacked in marketplaces where, days earlier, wedding festivities had taken place. The horror did not remain in Paris. Word spread, and the massacre metastasized, erupting in city after city: Orléans, Lyon, Rouen, Toulouse, Bordeaux. Across France, regional governors and Catholic leaders, emboldened by the king's silence, authorized their own purges. By the time the bloodletting subsided, as many as 30,000 Protestants had been killed. Not in battle, not by decree of court, but by the deliberate, targeted, ritualized extermination of civilians. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre remains one of the darkest acts of religious violence in European history. But what makes it even more horrifying is not just its scale, is that the man at the center of it was cracking apart in real time. He heard them. From his rooms in the Louvre, Charles heard the screams, the roar of the mobs, the howls of dying men, the prayers interrupted by knives, the desperate pleas for mercy. And something inside him collapsed. In the days following the massacre, the king, just 22 years old, began showing signs of deep psychological breakdown. He was no longer sleeping. He would weep uncontrollably during meetings. shake violently when presented with reports, and shout at imagined enemies in the corners of the room. One diplomat described Charles as a prince unmade, a soul unravelling before our eyes. He would pace for hours, muttering prayers, then erupt in screams so loud the palace guards thought he was under attack. He often insisted his food be tasted, then refused to eat at all. He began to believe that his own blood was turning black. The massacre was meant to stabilise the crown. Instead, it shattered the king. Catherine de' Medici, architect of the massacre, remained composed. She issued decrees, spun narratives, and flooded Europe with letters insisting that the violence was not planned, but a tragic consequence of political necessity. But Charles couldn't maintain the script. When Protestant envoys arrived for audience weeks later, he broke from the prepared message and screamed at them, "Yes, I did it. I gave the order, but it was your fault. Your fault. Your fault." He shouted so violently that blood burst from his mouth. The room went silent. His advisors were horrified. Catherine was livid. Whatever threads of loyalty or obedience had once bound him to her were now fraying. Charles had become unreliable, erratic, and worst of all, honest. He couldn't lie about what he'd done because he couldn't stop seeing it. Charles began having hallucinations. He claimed to see phantom Protestants in the halls. He would shout for guards to arrest shadows. He claimed Coligny's head visited him at night, eyes wide, mouth still accusing. Witnesses recorded that he would scratch at his own skin, trying to remove what he called the stink of murder. At times, his face would go white as he stared into nothing and muttered, "They're still screaming." And then he began to bleed. From the nose, from the gums, from the mouth, as if the massacre had finally come for him. By the winter of 1572, the palace at Vincennes no longer felt like a royal residence, it felt like a morgue. The curtains were always drawn, fires sputtered in their grates, the king's chambers smelled of sweat, iron and damp cloth soaked through with blood. There were no more banquets, no more hunts, no more music in the halls, only silence, broken intermittently by the king's screams. The first signs were subtle. Small bloodstains on his handkerchiefs, dismissed as a nosebleed or irritation from the dry winter air. But within weeks, the symptoms escalated. Blood began to leak from Charles's mouth during meetings, sometimes while speaking, sometimes simply while breathing. His physicians, baffled and frightened, attempted to hide the worst of it, but it was impossible. The bleeding grew worse, relentless, and soon it wasn't just his mouth. He began coughing deep, clotted gobs of blood, often staining his pillow through the night. Blood came from his gums, from his throat, from his pores. A chronicler wrote, "The king bleeds as though his soul seeks escape through the skin." They called it tuberculosis or consumption, but the courtiers whispered darker things, that the massacre had infected him spiritually, that he was being punished by God, that his body was replaying the horror he unleashed. Charles himself believed it. In rare moments of lucidity, he said, "My people bleed in my dreams, and so I bleed in waking." The physical symptoms were terrifying, but they were nothing compared to the voices. Charles could no longer sleep through the night. He would wake in fits, screaming for guards to get them out, get them out. No one was there, or rather, no one others could see. He spoke to ghosts, most often to Admiral Coligny, whom he saw not as a shadowy spectre, but as a rotting, bloodied corpse, still whispering judgment from the corner of his bedchamber. One night, Charles was found curled in the fireplace muttering, "Tell him to stop staring, please, tell him to blink." Other nights he claimed his room was filled with drowned children, victims from the Seine. He could describe their clothes, their names. When his mother confronted him, he accused her of sending them. He would gnaw at his own fingernails until they bled. He bit through a goblet during a fit. He tried to cut open his chest with a letter opener, shrieking that his heart was full of fire and smoke. The man who once ruled France now existed in perpetual psychosis, trapped in a waking nightmare of his own making. Catherine de' Medici never cried in public. She did not collapse. She did not wring her hands or pray aloud. She watched her son deteriorate with the quiet detachment of someone who had spent her entire life choosing dynasty over sentiment. She moved quickly to shift influence toward her next surviving son, Henri, Duke of Anjou, future Henry III. Catherine understood that Charles's body was failing, but more importantly, his mind was no longer useful.